You feel that icy chill settling deep into your marrow right now, a crushing weight in the center of your chest that makes every breath feel like inhaling lead. It didn't start today. You've been wandering through your own home like a ghost for weeks, feeling more invisible with every passing month. You've tried forced smiles, staying silent to keep the peace, and convincing yourself the exhaustion is just age. But that heavy pressure isn't a sign of weakness. It's your body's final warning that someone you trust is siphoning your life away. In the next few minutes, you will understand what is really happening. My name is Martha Evelyn Vance, a 71-year-old retired high school librarian who spent 40 years cataloging the worlds of others while neglecting to secure my own. For 5 decades, my husband Arthur was my compass, a meticulous civil engineer who filled our home with the scent of cedarwood shavings from his workshop. I can still hear the rhythmic tap of his wedding ring against the oak table when he was deep in thought. Now, 4 days after a sudden pulmonary embolism stole his breath, I am adrift. I feel like an invisible woman, a ghost haunting a life I no longer control. Without Arthur's hand, I am just a shadow waiting for permission to exist. My daily ritual is a performance of obedience for my eldest son, Leo, a successful investment expert who manages every cent. I sit at the kitchen table clutching Arthur's old wool cardigan, smelling the faint tobacco and peppermint that defined him, while Leo scrutinizes our dwindling grocery list. I haven't seen my daughter Sarah in years. Leo says she's greedy, though Arthur always hid $20 bills in books just for her. Before I continue this journey of betrayal, I want to thank you for being here. Please comment below with the city you are watching from today. While certain details are fictionalized for protection, the emotional weight of this true story remains a heavy burden for my family. I sat in Arthur's workshop, the scent of cedarwood still clinging to the walls like a desperate memory. I was looking for his old ledger, the one he kept with military precision for 40 years. Leo told me all the accounts were emptied by medical bills, yet I found Arthur's favorite fountain pen resting on a stack of recent bank statements I hadn't seen. The pen was uncapped, a smudge of wet blue ink staining the top page dated March 12, 2026. Arthur never left a pen uncapped. He was a man of ritual and order. I stared at the blotch, telling myself Leo was just disorganized during the crisis, but my heart felt a strange, cold flutter. Later that evening, while Leo was loudly debating the cost of the viewing room on his cell phone, he left his leather briefcase open on the sofa. I went to close it, my librarian instincts twitching at the clutter, when I saw a folded receipt from a high-end jewelry store tucked into a side pocket. It was for a Rolex Submariner, purchased on April 26th, the very day Arthur took his last breath. The amount was $18,000, paid in cash. This was the same son who just hours ago wept about how we couldn't afford a mahogany casket for his father. The receipt didn't just contradict his words, it screamed a truth I was terrified to name. I moved through the house like a thief in my own life, my heart hammering against my ribs every time the floorboards groaned under my weight. Leo was at the lawyer's office, or so he claimed, leaving me with 2 hours of silence to verify the impossible. I returned to Arthur's workshop, focusing on the floorboards beneath his heavy mahogany desk. Arthur always said that a man's true character is found in what he anchors to the ground. I found a loose plank, wedged tight with a library card from 1988. Beneath it sat a small, fireproof pouch containing a logbook of cash transfers I never authorized, totaling $400,000 since January 2025. The logbook wasn't just a list of numbers. It was a map of my son's systematic betrayal. Every entry coincided with a day Leo had visited us, claiming he was just checking on his father's health. I remembered him sitting on the porch with his laptop, looking like the devoted son, while he was actually siphoning the lifeblood out of our retirement. The dates were precise: February 14th, March 22nd, and April 10th. I felt a cold, oily slick of nausea rise in my throat. I had spent 40 years teaching children the value of truth, yet I had raised a man who treated his parents like an ATM. I found a letter from Grand Oak Estates, a luxury senior living facility I had never heard of, addressed to Leo personally. It was dated February 15, 2026. The letter confirmed a non-refundable deposit of $12,000 for a single occupancy suite, starting May 1st. My breath hitched as I realized May 1st was only 3 days away. Leo hadn't just stolen the money. He had already planned my relocation to a place 4 hours away from everything I knew. This wasn't a financial struggle caused by Arthur's medical bills, as he claimed. This was a calculated eviction, a cold-blooded plan to discard me like old furniture. I knew I couldn't do this alone, so I called the one person who had already handed me a weapon, Mr. Thomas Henderson, the funeral director. He arrived at the back door of the workshop at precisely 2:15 p.m., his gray suit as sharp as his gaze. He didn't offer empty platitudes or fake sympathy. He simply opened a black leather portfolio and laid out a series of internal ledger prints from his own vault. Mr. Henderson had worked with Arthur for 30 years, and he looked at me with a grim respect that made me feel visible for the first time since the funeral began. We had work to do. Mr. Henderson pointed to a specific line item in the 1995 trust agreement that I had missed during the initial shock. "Martha," he said, his voice low and steady, "the $50,000 wasn't just for a casket. It was the seed money for a much larger protective shield Arthur built." He then showed me a digital scan of a deed. It wasn't for our house, but for a commercial property in downtown Crestview that Arthur bought in 2002. Leo had been collecting the rent, $3,000 every month, for the last 5 years, telling me the property had been sold to cover taxes. The scale of the theft was staggering. I clutched the edge of the workbench, the rough grain of the cedar wood biting into my palms as I processed the depth of the deception. My own son had looked me in the eye every Sunday for 5 years, eating the pot roast I labored over, while pocketing money that could have paid for Arthur's best treatments. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my chest that made every breath a struggle. I wasn't just losing my husband. I was losing the memory of the boy I had tucked into bed. The monster in the expensive suit was a stranger wearing my son's face. Mr. Henderson then dropped the second bombshell, a stack of wire transfer receipts he had obtained through an old contact at the bank. "Leo didn't just spend the money, Martha. He's been moving it to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under a shell company called AV Investment Holdings. The total amount transferred over the last 18 months exceeded $2 million. This wasn't just a son skimming off the top. This was a high-level embezzlement scheme designed to leave the estate a hollow shell. The realization that my son was a professional criminal, not just a greedy child, sent a shiver through my soul. As we dug deeper, we realized Leo wasn't working alone. He had signed documents as power of attorney, using a notary named Brenda, who I recognized as his personal assistant and our distant cousin. Brenda had been at the house 2 days ago, crying over Arthur's casket. Yet she was the one who helped Leo forge my signature on the house sale documents. The conspiracy had tendrils that reached into my own extended family, turning people I trusted into silent accomplices. My world was shrinking, the walls of the workshop feeling closer, as I realized I was surrounded by wolves who had been waiting for Arthur to fall. I stood at the window, watching Leo's black SUV pull into the driveway, knowing I had to play the part of the grieving, helpless widow for just a few more hours. The evidence was in my hands, but the danger was now immediate. If Leo suspected I knew, he would vanish with the remaining millions before the police could arrive. "I need to ask you something vital right now because I feel so alone in this house. If you discovered your own child was systematically destroying your life, would you call the police immediately or try to handle it privately? Type justice or family in the comments below." We moved from the workshop to the sterile back office of the funeral home, where the smell of lilies was replaced by the cold, metallic scent of a high-speed scanner. Mr. Henderson sat across from me, his face a mask of grim determination as he pulled up the encrypted records linked to the 1995 trust. The numbers flickering across the monitor didn't just represent money. They represented every hour of overtime Arthur worked while I thought he was resting. We discovered that the $2 million in the Cayman account was only the liquid portion of the theft. Leo had also used the house as collateral for a private loan of $600,000 on January 14th. The discovery of the private loan led us to the signature pages, and that's when my heart truly shattered into jagged pieces. Brenda, my own niece and Leo's assistant, had notarized every single document with a steady hand and a cold heart. I remembered her hugging me at the viewing, her tears dampening my shoulder, while she knew she had signed away the roof over my head. This wasn't just my son acting in a vacuum of greed. It was a coordinated harvest of my life by the people I shared Thanksgiving dinner with. The betrayal by Brenda made the air in the room feel thin and toxic, a suffocating realization of total isolation. Mr. Henderson leaned forward, pointing to a small, handwritten note stapled to the back of the 1995 agreement. It mentioned a cigar box stored at the Crestview Safety Deposit Center, accessible only by a physical key Arthur had hidden. This was the trigger for the forensic audit Arthur planned decades ago. If the prepaid funds were ever questioned, the bank was instructed to freeze all related accounts immediately. I felt a surge of cold hope, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Leo likely knew about the box too. He had been searching Arthur's workshop for days, tearing through cedar shavings and old blueprints, looking for that specific brass key. The tension shifted from financial to physical when Leo returned home early that evening, his black SUV screeching to a halt in the driveway. He didn't walk into the kitchen with his usual polished arrogance. He slammed the door, his eyes bloodshot and pacing like a trapped animal. He dropped a manila folder on the table, containing a medical evaluation form he wanted me to sign. It was an application for a psychiatric observation hold at a facility in North Carolina. Leo wasn't just trying to take my money anymore. He was preparing to label me incompetent to nullify any legal challenge I might mount against the estate transfers. My hand shook as I read the fine print on the medical form, noticing the date of admission was set for May 1st at 8 a.m. That was less than 72 hours away, the same day I was supposed to be moved to Grand Oak Estates. Leo stood over me, his shadow stretching long and dark across the linoleum floor, smelling of expensive gin and desperation. He told me I was forgetting things, and that Dad would have wanted me to be safe and supervised. The walls of the house I had lived in for 50 years suddenly felt like the bars of a very expensive, very silent cage. I managed to hide my fear, feigning a sudden dizzy spell to retreat to the workshop where I had hidden my phone. I called Mr. Henderson, who had discovered a third accomplice, our family lawyer, Marcus Thorne. Marcus had been Arthur's friend for 30 years, yet he was the one who provided Leo with the power of attorney templates back in 2024. They had been planning this since Arthur's first heart scare, treating my husband's mortality like a business opportunity. The network was closing in, a web of professionals and relatives who had all agreed that a 71-year-old librarian was too invisible to fight back or even notice. Mr. Henderson sent me a screenshot of a wire transfer that had occurred only 4 hours ago, while I was supposedly napping. Leo had moved another $85,000 from the commercial property account into a shell company called LAV Strategic Partners. This was the final sweep of the remaining liquid assets before the house sale finalized on Monday morning. I realized that if I didn't find Arthur's hidden key within the next 12 hours, the paper trail would be scrubbed clean by Marcus Thorne's legal team. I was standing on the edge of a total wipeout, my husband's legacy being deleted one keystroke at a time by my own flesh. Leo knocked on the workshop door, his voice dripping with a terrifying, calculated kindness that made my skin crawl. He asked if I had found the old brass key Arthur used to keep in his desk, claiming he wanted to save the cigar box as a memento. I realized then that he didn't have the key, and without it, he couldn't stop the audit from triggering once the funeral service began. The risk was no longer just about the money. It was about the next 48 hours of my survival. If he found the key first, he could destroy the evidence and commit me to the psychiatric ward before I could speak. I looked out the window and saw a dark sedan parked across the street. Two men I didn't recognize watching our front door. Leo noticed my gaze and smiled, a cold, empty expression that told me I was now a prisoner in my own home until the move. I found something in Arthur's old library book that changes everything, but what I'm about to show you is truly disturbing. This next part involves a betrayal so dark that it might be hard to hear, and if you have a weak heart, you should probably stop watching now. Before I reveal the contents of that book, are you still with me in this fight? I retreated to the workshop, my fingers trembling as I reached for the one book Leo hadn't checked, the 1988 edition of Architectural Foundations. Inside the hollowed-out center, I found the brass key, but beneath it lay a micro-cassette recorder and a medical report from February 12th. The report wasn't about Arthur's heart. It was a private toxicology screen he had commissioned in secret. My lungs felt like they were filling with lead as I read the results. High traces of digitalis, a medication Arthur was never prescribed. He knew someone was slowly stopping his heart, and he used his final weeks to build a digital cage for the monster responsible. The betrayal was a slow-motion murder. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, my knees buckling against the workbench as the air left my chest. This wasn't a sudden pulmonary embolism. It was a calculated chemical execution masked as natural decay. I clutched the microcassette, my vision blurring as I pictured Leo standing over his father, smiling with that same calculated kindness while handing him a glass of poisoned water. My stomach churned with a violent, oily heat, a mixture of primal terror and a mother's devastating grief. I realized that the medical bills Leo complained about were actually the costs of the very toxins he used to silence the man who gave him everything. Memory flooded back like a broken dam, forcing me to see the devoted son in a terrifying new light. I remembered Leo insisting on being the only one to handle Arthur's nightly supplements, his hands steady as he prepared the small white cups. I saw the way he'd watch Arthur breathe, his eyes cold and clinical, waiting for the stumble or the gasp that never came until it was too late. I thought of the vintage car Leo sold, realizing now he needed the cash to pay off the corrupt doctor who signed the death certificate. My daughter Sarah was right to be suspicious. I had ignored her warnings to protect a monster wearing my son's face. I tucked the recorder into my cardigan, the cold plastic feeling like a holy relic against my skin as I prepared to face the man I once called my son. The audit wasn't just about the $2 million. It was the bait Arthur set to ensure Leo would be in the funeral home when the police arrived. I checked the workshop door, hearing Leo's footsteps approaching, heavy and entitled, unaware that he was walking into a 30-year-old trap. Before I step out to end this nightmare, I must ask you, are you still standing here with me? Or has the darkness of this truth become too much to bear? Type present in the comments right now. The funeral service at St. Jude's Chapel was a masterpiece of orchestrated hypocrisy, with Leo standing by the mahogany casket he didn't pay for, greeting guests with practiced sorrow. I stood near the altar, the brass key and the microcassette recorder heavy in my pocket, watching Detective Miller and two uniformed officers slip into the back pews. Mr. Henderson stood at the lectern, his grim face illuminated by the flickering candlelight as he cleared his throat to begin the special reading Arthur had requested in 1995. Leo's face paled when he saw the golden seal folder in the director's hands, realizing the audit was no longer a threat, but a live, ticking grenade. I stepped forward before the first prayer, my voice ringing through the vaulted ceiling with a strength I hadn't felt in decades. I looked Leo in the eye and demanded he explain the $18,000 Rolex receipt and the $2 million offshore transfers to AV Investment Holdings. The mourners gasped, their whispers like a swarm of angry bees as Leo laughed nervously, dismissing my words as the ramblings of a grieving, confused mind. He tried to lead me away, his grip on my arm tightening like a vice, but I pulled the micro-cassette recorder from my cardigan and pressed play. His own voice filled the chapel, discussing the digitalis dosage with Brenda in a cold, clinical tone. The sound of his own betrayal shattered Leo's polished facade, his eyes darting toward the exits as Detective Miller stepped into the aisle. He didn't just deny it. He exploded in a fit of narcissistic rage, screaming that Arthur was a controlling relic who didn't deserve the wealth he hoarded. "I earned that money by putting up with his rules for 40 years, he roared, his face turning a dark, mottled purple as he confessed to the expedited inheritance. He admitted to forging my signature with Brenda's help, claiming I was too incompetent to manage the $3,000 in monthly rent from the Crestview property. Every word was a nail in his own coffin. Detective Miller didn't wait for him to finish. He moved with surgical precision, spinning Leo around and forcing his hands behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed louder than any organ chord, a sound of absolute finality that made the air in the chapel feel suddenly breathable. Brenda collapsed into a pew, sobbing and pointing at Leo, shouting that he had forced her to notarize the house sale under threat of termination. As the officers read Leo his Miranda rights, the guests he had tried to impress looked on with visceral disgust. The son who tried to bury his father in a scrap wood box was now being escorted out in steel. The justice that followed was as meticulous and unyielding as one of Arthur's engineering blueprints, leaving no room for Leo's expensive lawyers to maneuver through the evidence. 3 months later, a stern judge sentenced Leo to 25 years in a maximum security facility for first-degree murder and grand embezzlement, exceeding $2 million. Marcus Thorne, the family lawyer, had his legal license revoked permanently and received 10 years for criminal conspiracy, while Brenda was sentenced to 5 years for felony forgery. Every cent stolen from the Cayman accounts was frozen and ordered returned to the estate, along with the $600,000 from the fraudulent house loan. The commercial property in downtown Crestview was officially restored to my sole, undisputed ownership. As Leo was led away to the transport van, my daughter Sarah emerged from the shadows of the vestibule, her eyes wet with the same relief I felt. We stood together on the chapel steps, watching the flashing blue lights fade into the gray afternoon, the heavy weight of the invisible woman finally lifting from my shoulders. The funeral director, Mr. Henderson, handed me the final audit report, a document that proved Arthur's love had survived the very poison that took his life. I looked up at the sky, noticing the clouds breaking to reveal a sliver of bright, unyielding sun. The garden was mine again, and the truth had finally finished its long journey home. 12 months have passed since the iron gates closed behind Leo, and the silence in our home has finally transformed from a suffocating weight into a peaceful sanctuary of cedarwood and sunlight. I spent the last spring working with Sarah to establish the Arthur Vance Memorial Literacy Foundation, using the recovered millions to renovate the local high school library where I once labored in obscurity. Every Tuesday morning, I sit on the porch of our restored Crestview property, sipping peppermint tea and watching children cycle past. The scars of the betrayal remain, a dull ache when I see an old photo. But the victory of reclaiming my dignity feels like a warm, unyielding shield around my heart. I look at you now and realize that money is never just currency. It is a seed that eventually reveals the true landscape of a human heart. You must remember that the concept of Dad's revenge isn't about hatred, but about a love so powerful it reaches through the grave to protect what is sacred. I was too blind, too willing to be invisible. But I've learned that what is done in the dark will always be dragged into the light. Please share this story with someone who needs to know that the truth has no expiration date. Comment, share, and subscribe to join us. Disclaimer: this narrative contains fictionalized elements. Consult legal professionals for actual estate matters.